Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati bookstore and the host for tonight's event. We are pleased to welcome Melissa Fu and Lillian Li to our At Home with Literati series in support of Peach Blossom Spring. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase Peach Blossom Spring throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any time. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now, allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Melissa Fu grew up in northern New Mexico and has lived in Texas, Colorado, New York, Ohio, and Washington. She now lives near Cambridge, United Kingdom, with her husband and children. With academic backgrounds in physics and English, she has worked in education as a teacher, curriculum developer, and consultant. She was the 2018-19 David T. Key Wong Fellow and at the University of East Anglia.
Anglia.
Yeah, yikes. Peach Blossom Spring is her first novel. Lillian Li received her BA from Princeton and her MFA from the University of Michigan. She is a recipient of a Hopwood Award in short fiction, as well as a Glimmer Train's New Writer Award. Her work has been featured in Guernica, Grant, and Jezebel. She is from the DC metro area and lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And at Number One Chinese Restaurant is her first novel. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Melissa and Lillian.
Right. Thanks so much, Atticus. So before we get started into a Q&A, I think that we would all love to hear Melissa read from this amazing book, which if you haven't had a chance yet to read it, I highly, highly encourage it. But I think that Melissa will be able to also give you a taste of what is so incredible about her debut.
Thank you, Lillian. Great to be here. And I'm going to read just from the very beginning of Peach Blossom Spring. So no need to set it up, just open the book and start. So it takes place in China. We've got a map here of China 1938. And it's dedicated to my dad. So, and my family. This is called Origins. Tell us, they say, tell us where you're from. He is from walking and walking and walking. He is from shoes filled with holes, blistered toes and calloused heels that know the roughness of gravel roads and the relief in straw and grass. He is from staying each night in a different place, sometimes city, sometimes country. From roads that wrap around mountains and dip through valleys. From waterways shrouded in fog and mist. He is from walking across China. Tell us your memories, they say. He remembers kerosene lamps burning low, the smell of wood smoke, cold stone floors under his bare feet, urgent voices, the rasping of coins, carts creaking at night. He remembers a sandalwood puzzle picture. One way up, there were 100 monkeys. Turn it over, there were 99. How did that monkey appear and disappear? He is from this mystery. Tell us more, they say, as they nestle by his side. How did you come here? He crossed rivers. He crossed oceans. He carried a watch bought from a sailor, a letter to open doors, a suitcase, a packet of light blue aerograms, a single pair of wool socks. He went towards the call of a beautiful country, a beckoning dream, a promise made of air. Towards wing beats of birds, kaleidoscopes of seasons he'd never imagined before. And now, they say, their eyes clear and voices playful, tell us a story. To know a story is to stroke the silken surfaces of loss, to feel the weight of beauty in his hands. To know a story is to carry it always, etched in his bones, even if dormant for decades. Tell us, they insist. To tell a story he realizes, is to plant a seed and let it grow.
So now not only do I encourage all of you to read this amazing book, I also encourage you after you read it to reread the first part, because having heard it a second time, having read all the pages, everything just has so much extra meaning. It just feels like a book that you could cycle through again and again, because there's this element of it feels like a fable the way that this first section begins, and yet there isn't very much exaggeration once you read the novel. When he says, "I walked through China," you think, sure, how could that be possible? But then the journey that Ren Shu, who is the narrator of that section, and his family, as they're escaping the Japanese invasion, as they're escaping the civil war between the nationalists and the communists, it's just really incredible how, in some ways, this opening chapter is a promise that you make to the reader, and you fully fulfill that promise. I'm just kind of, experiencing my own amazement. Melissa, you'll have to excuse me.
Oh, do you know that is such a gift to hear, because I don't know if I'm jumping the gun here, but that opening I've always had when this was originally a short story. And I brought it to a writer's group. And one of the comments that just struck me so much is somebody said, "You set out a promise that you didn't fulfill in the short story." And I thought, no, how can I do? So hearing you say that, it's like, oh, I fulfilled the promise now, or at least for you.
Absolutely. I love that. Writing groups can say just the most cut to the core things, because only a writer knows how to read another writer in a certain way.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also love the way that you read it, the kind of repetition of people saying, "Tell us this story, tell us this story." Having read the full story, I can see now that there is, in the repetition, something almost painful that's happening to the narrator. When people ask them to tell a story, there's this feeling of how could I possibly encompass everything that I've been through into a neat little story for you. You really need the hours that you spend with this book, the hours I'm sure it took for you to write this, to fully encompass this narrator's story, the story of his entire family, the generation before, the generation after. So I never really understood how almost unaware it can be to ask someone to tell a story, because you're kind of asking them to tell you everything in a neat little way.
Yeah, you never know what kind of box you're opening.
Yeah.
Story.
And so, before I go off too much on a tangent about just all my feelings about this book, because you mentioned that this book was first a short story, I also wanted to touch on something that you wrote in your acknowledgements, which is that you write, "When I first started writing about my father's fruit trees, I didn't know I would end up writing a novel that spanned 70 years and tried to make sense of China's tumultuous 20th century. Which honestly, that just feels like a parable for any novel writer. We just never know what we're about to get into before it's too late. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't start in the first place. But to be more specific to your experience, what was your journey to writing this novel?
Okay, so I did have this short story that I mentioned, and the reason I wrote that was my dad always wanted to grow fruit trees when I was growing up, and they were always a disaster. It was kind of a joke, but it was a bit sad, anything that could go wrong with a fruit tree in northern New Mexico did with his trees. And then after he retired and was sort of a little bit away from what had been a rather stressful job, and they moved from the town where I grew up, he just threw some peach pits in the back garden, and he didn't think about it. And the next spring, my mom came and said, "Jerry, there are baby trees back there," and this was the most miraculous thing to us. He tended those trees, and I wanted to write a story about that. So I wrote this short story, but I think, like you say, you never know what you're getting into when you start to write a story. And that very, very keen reader said, no, there's more going on here than what you've just told. So I just thought, how can I do justice? How can I make people be as amazed with the fact that my father finally grew some trees as I was? And I realized that they needed to know about him and about his life. But I didn't know much about him and his life. And he told us just a little bit, not too much. I had some notes from 20 years ago. So I had to make up a story that could have been, would be similar to what he had lived through. So that was sort of how I got on the road to writing what became a novel.
And I'm sure that, there were all kinds of twists and turns in that journeys, directions that you went in and then had to go backwards when you realized it wasn't quite the right way to go. It's never quite as straightforward as what we see on the pages before us. And I can only imagine the challenges that you face because of just the ambitious sweep and breadth of this novel. I mean, it's not even just that it's 70 years. It's 70 years of some of the most politically tumultuous times in China. And it is also not just one person's story, it's 3 generations of stories. And I mean, even just focusing on the first half or so of this novel, which takes us through the family escaping the Japanese invasion, then their immigration to Taiwan during the Chinese Civil War between the communists and nationalists. It's both so grand and yet so finely drawn. And I have to know, how did you decide what to show from that time in history that would evoke this period without taking like 10 volumes of work in the process?
Yeah, great question. And I really had to think about that a lot. Like well, first I had to get a sense of what the time was like, the history. When I started off, I knew very, very little about the Japanese invasion. I knew that there was one. And likewise, I knew that there was a Chinese Civil War, and the result of which was, many families left, including mine, and went to Taiwan and other places. I mean, there was quite a large exodus. So how did I decide which bits of history to highlight and how to shape it and not drown in all of what was happening? I think at some point I had some really good advice from a writing instructor or a teacher, and she said, do all your research, do enough to you kind of think you have a grasp of what's going on, then close the research books, write the story, and then go back. And so I had this line that I wanted to follow, a trajectory. I kind of knew where I wanted the characters to go. And part of that came from these few notes I had from my dad about where their family actually had been. So I kind of knew where they would go, and I had a few fun anecdotes from him and other sort of scary anecdotes that I knew I wanted to put in. So then in order to try to be in that time and not stand up here with the, 2019, but 2019 sensibility and look back at the work, I had to just sort of think, well, what if I was, one of these children, or what if I was a mother with a little boy trying to move through China? What would I see in front of me, and what would I not be aware of? So there are lots of big events that I've left out because my characters wouldn't have known, even though they later shaped history in huge ways. But so I guess I tried to just think about what they would have known and seen, and what I found useful for that were various memoirs and autobiographies of people looking back. Although you always have that 2020 hindsight. You always get that sort of flavor. So trying to, I guess, take away the hindsight.
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it. And taking away the hindsight is, I mean, there's already some of that has to happen when you write a novel set in any kind of time, because you're essentially putting a character through things that you've planned beforehand for them, but you have to act and embody what they would experience, having this thing kind of come out of nowhere. And then with the additional historical challenge of what you're facing, the hindsight of knowing what's in the history books, how we think about it now, like you said, with the 2019 sensibility, how we personally feel about what happened, and how that will probably continue to change generation after generation. I think that there's just something really challenging, but also really necessary about restricting your novel's insights to what your characters would actually be experiencing and believing in that time. And focusing in on Mei Lin, who is kind of the main character of the first third or half of the novel that's set in China and Taiwan. I love that we follow her. She is just such an incredible character because in some ways she's such a vulnerable person. Like you mentioned, she is the mother to a 4-year-old boy. She's effectively a single mother, although she's traveling with her kind of extended family. There are these 2 terrible wars back to back happening. She's going through so much grief and chaos. And at the same time, she becomes very resourceful and savvy in order to survive, and also actually to build a life for herself and her family. And I'm personally, I find myself to be a very unsavvy person. And so I'm always really interested in hearing how novelists write really clever characters who are able to kind of see through the lines and get to a place where the average person wouldn't be able to go. And so I just want to hear you talk a little bit more about how you came to create Mei Lin, maybe what parts of her were easiest to write and maybe what parts were a little harder for you to reach for her.
Okay. Mei Lin, so she was really fun to write. She is the most, to the extent that, there are some analogs between real people and fictional characters in this book. She's the most fictional. And I learned a lot from that because I think, because I didn't have too much of an allegiance to a person who I knew well. I mean, she's maybe sort of vaguely based on my father's mother, my Nai, but I didn't know her very well. I loved her a lot, but I didn't know her well. But that gave me a lot of freedom to imagine this person. And I think maybe some of what makes her who she is the more I researched the war, I wasn't really looking at political stances and sort of military viewpoints. I really looked at how women were impacted, and I found memoirs of many different of women in oral histories, and I think I was struck by the strength of real people who were as clever and insightful. And maybe I did that novelist thing of taking a thread from this person and this person. So in a sense, she's a little bit of a combination, but also an homage to a lot of the amazing women who I did read about, who did really struggle. And you'd read about their sort of tricks they would think of or ways they would fool people. And so I guess I poured a lot of that into her.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And, that's making me think about another really amazing element of your novel, a thread that kind of ties all these generations together, which is this family scroll that Mei Lin is given by her husband as almost a down payment on their dreams of opening an antique store before the war effectively overturns all of those hopes. And I just love how the scroll essentially feels magic. It feels like that you're always able to unroll a new painting, a new scene. And then from that scene, the family is always able to come up with just an amazing Chinese fable. Sometimes it seems like they also make up their own stories because the scenes painted on this elaborate scroll, this seemingly never-ending scroll, is such a vivid painting that they're able to create their own narratives. And I think that throughout this novel, you have these fables that come through with, tricksters sometimes, wise monks other times. And it's an element of your novel that just feels like so alive and so vivid. And it helps the family impart lessons. It helps comfort them through really hard times. And I just had to, I wondered, how did you pick which fables to include? Because I'm sure, China has just thousands of these kinds of fables. And did you have any that you love that you just couldn't put into the novel?
Yeah, so I think I started off with I had maybe 2 or 3, and one person said, don't add any more, that's enough. And then someone else said, no, more. And so this is sort of a lesson in when you get feedback, listen to the person who you agree with. Well, I don't know. But so some of those stories I've just always known, and I stuck them in. And others I looked for ones that that felt like they would be easy to remember and hold on to. And yeah, there were some I did leave out. And so I guess if I felt like there were some I knew I couldn't do justice to, from what small understanding I knew of some of, the character, and I'll try to say it properly, but Zhuge Liang, the Three Kingdoms, and some of those stories that are so famous, people just need to read them on their own. So I have one character telling those stories, but we only know that he's telling them. We don't actually hear him telling them. And so I guess I looked for shorter ones that you could hold easily, and ones that you could tell a child. Although it was hard to leave them out. I think there were some. Now that I'm thinking about it, because there are some great episodes with this great military strategist, he was this Zhuge Liang, and there's lots of really fun stories about him. But maybe they didn't really serve the narrative. So I'm finding my way towards the answer here. In the end, the ones that stayed were ones that could maybe reflect what was happening in the larger story, which maybe was, you could think, well, this is why the mother is telling a story about this.
Absolutely. And it also makes sense in a book that is about memory and what stays and what kind of ends up either being shut away or erased, that the fables that exist in this book are ones that would make sense for the characters to remember, perhaps because they were imparted during a moment where they were learning a life lesson, or because it was something that echoed in later events for them. And one of the fables, especially that, actually, I wonder if you would be able to tell a version of it, which is the fable of the old man and the stallion. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you be able to tell the audience what that fable is?
Sure, I could even read it. It's rather short.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. From here. Yeah, that is one of the ones I've known for such a long time. I remember learning that fable and then never forgetting it. Let me grab it. I know where it is.
I love that.
I mean, all right. So this is actually the first story that Lin, the mother, tells her son, and they've just endured they're out on the road, they've been walking, and they've just survived an aerial attack from Japanese planes coming, and they were just shooting people walking on the roads, and there were hundreds of people walking, thousands, just walking, trying to get to the west of China. So they don't know where their family is. She doesn't know what to do. She's got this really special scroll, and she wants to calm her young boy down. So she gets the scroll out, and I'll start from this. She unrolls the scroll, and it's a hand scroll, so it's not like one of the long hanging ones. It's sort of Chinese hand scrolls. They're meant to meant to be viewed in a very intimate way. They're maybe 12 inches or so, about a foot. And you look at one scene at a time. In each scene, I've read, it's the width of two people sitting side by side.
Wow.
So she opens it up there, there's devastation all around them. She pulls out this treasure. He knows that she has it, but she hasn't, he hasn't seen it for a while. She unrolls it, and now I'll read what I wrote. She unrolls the scroll to show a flourishing farm and a nobleman with a gray beard sitting aside a stallion. Renshu leans into her, looking at the horse. She knows this is one of his favorite scenes on the scroll. There was once an old man from the frontier who had a great stallion, she begins. It was dark brown, glossy and strong, with a long black mane and a wild look in its eye. It was known to be the most gallant horse in all the neighboring towns and villages. As she tells the story, she feels herself relaxing into its rhythms, letting the images carry her away, however briefly, from her own despair. Everyone said he must be the luckiest man to have such a noble beast. It was the envy of all. But one day, the stallion ran away. And of course, everyone said this was a great tragedy. What terrible luck. Renshu groans in sympathy. But the old man didn't despair. Instead, he said, "What makes you so certain this isn't a blessing?" A few weeks later, the stallion came galloping back home, followed by a beautiful wild mare, and soon there was a colt. The three magnificent creatures brought pride and prosperity to the old man, and everyone said this was cause for great celebration. But the old man said, "What makes you so certain this isn't a curse?" The villagers couldn't believe he'd say such a thing, but a few days later, the man's only son fell while riding the stallion and broke his leg. With the harvest coming in soon, this doubled the old man's work in the fields. "Oh, such misfortune," said the villagers. But the old man said, "What makes you so certain this isn't a blessing?" Renshu finishes. "Yes, that's exactly what he said," Malin smiles. And not long after, a battle broke out between neighboring warlords, and all the men in the village had to go fight, except for the old and the infirm. And because of his broken leg, the man's son was spared. The fight was bloody and vicious, and none of the men who went came back. And it was only because the man was old and his son was lame that they survived to take care of each other for many years. Malin pauses for a moment. Within every misfortune, there is a blessing, and within every blessing, the seeds of misfortune. And so it goes until the end of time.
Oh my God, amazing. Thank you so much for reading that. So I wanted you to read that in part because that's actually my dad's favorite fable. And every time he asks me, "Have I told you this one before?" And if I were a better daughter, I would say, "No, you've never told me before," instead of saying like, "Yeah, you've told me 100 times, Dad," because I'll still tell it anyways. And I love how this fable echoes throughout the novel. It's, is the blessing, is it a curse, is something that Malin thinks. It's also something that her son Renshu thinks. And it's such an interesting idea because you really can't say for sure if something is a blessing or a curse until your life is over. And even then, there's a generation after that, the generation after that, like you just read. Can you ever know for certain? And in a book where you have 3 generations and there's a sense of, you could obviously keep going generation after generation. We start with Mei Lin, the mother, then we go into Renshu, the son, and then eventually his daughter, Lily. I wonder if your thinking had changed over whether the events in your novel, the wars that start the novel to begin with, are they a blessing or a curse?
Oh, gosh. Yeah, a little of both, aren't they? I mean, of course they're a curse, but then like maybe it's what Malin does, what comes of them. So they are a curse with the seeds a blessing, right? And then maybe it's that imagery of the seeds again, and maybe that links in with your idea of generations, because you just never know how something's going to play out. Although, yeah, I mean, it is tragic, really tough century for China. I mean, those early years, it's hard to say that there's good things that came from that, although maybe good things despite all that really tore apart the country. Yeah.
And there is something about how, these fables come from so many centuries past, that there is a sense of how much tragedy have we seen over the centuries. And yet this, why this fable still resonates across, all our generations, maybe the sense of having seen so many centuries of tragedy, you've also seen so many centuries of, blessings as well.
Yeah. And maybe it's sort of like how we were talking about, that we have to think about, like, if we're novelists, we have to think about our what our characters can see, and they only experience what they experience. Or, I mean, I guess people, we only experience what we're living right now, and even if we can look and feel like we're wise to what, because something happened in the past and we're looking back, maybe we think we're wise about it, but actually
right. Yeah, there is this sense in the fable of, like, who knows?
Yeah.
We'll never figure it out. So I feel like, yeah, that's something that the only wisdom of the ancients is, like, we don't know. Well, I think that it's, a really great point also that that is also what Malin makes of it, and how she chooses to see the events of her life and make a life regardless. And I thought it was very interesting to see her and how she kind of absorbs her trauma in comparison to how Renshu, her son, absorbs his trauma, because the really amazing thing about Mei Lin is that even as she grows more resourceful, more savvy, she continues to have her heart be open. And actually, a lot of the times when she is very clever and savvy, she actually gets what she wants by building relationships with people, by not going into a situation with, a demand in mind or wanting to necessarily distrust the people around her. And it's very interesting to think how Renshu, he has a lot more of a sense of paranoia to some extent, which is not unfounded. When he goes to America, he essentially self-isolates from the Chinese community there, because there's this sense that at any point, by getting involved with politics accidentally, going to the wrong party at the wrong time, because it's such a really electric political time, he might lose his place in America and be sent back and have his passport taken away. So in general, I'm just very interested in how you balance with your characters the ways that they absorb trauma and whether or not they kind of close themselves down to preserve or continue to open themselves up. How did you balance those ideas?
Yeah, I don't know. How did I? Maybe it was sort of in the DNA of the characters themselves. The way, I guess, Malin always, from the beginning, she's always solving problems, and even before the whole family falls apart, she's already trying to read the situation, reading people, reading rooms. She's just, that's sort of who she is as a person. There was a paragraph that I took out that there was more than one, but this one in particular was about how whenever she walks into a room, I think I took it out. I kind of forget after a while, but she reads the room. She looks to see where the allegiances are and who has the power, and so she's always it's self-serving, but it's not malicious. She needs to think about where her allegiance needs to be. And so she does, as you point out, she makes a lot of friendships, and they're genuine friendships, but they are ways to survive. But part of that, maybe maybe she overcompensates a little bit, because Renshu, she takes such good care of him that she's always looking out for him, that he doesn't know how to look out for himself as well. So maybe he makes a couple of mistakes, and oh, you're too trusting, somebody tells him a few times. And it's a muscle that he didn't develop that well, to discern when to trust and when not to trust. And then he's got a double migration, where she went from China to Taiwan, which was a migration, but she didn't then go to another country where she would be even more isolated and fewer people, although the people who went to Taiwan was already a different country from China, but to go then to the West, it's already a whole new set of unknowns for this character Renshu to try to understand. And so I think that may be a little bit why it's harder for him to absorb the trauma and learn from it, because he's maybe still kind of paddling. It looks like he's in the promised land, or the beautiful country. He's far away. He's getting this amazing education. Everyone should be proud of him. But once again, the floor has been pulled out from under his feet, and he's got to find his way. And maybe he doesn't quite know how as well, since his mom did such a good job.
Yes. I think all of that makes so much sense. And that double migration aspect is, it's very, striking to think about how when you don't even have your feet solidly on the ground in one place, it gets yanked out again. Even if you're the one who did the yanking, that's still something that is going to change the way that you think about the world. And I think that we touched a little bit on where Renshu ultimately goes when he goes to America. So first he studies at Northwestern, and then he ultimately gets a job in Los Alamos in New Mexico, working in the labs. And you and I were talking a little bit about how both our fathers actually did spend some time in Los Alamos, and our families as well. And it's a strange place. And your novel does such an amazing job of really capturing all its dimensions of strangeness. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what kind of Los Alamos is as a town. Why is it so strange, and how does it fit with the rest of your novel?
Los Alamos, it needs its own novel, but
Yes.
but it needed to be in this one too. So Los Alamos is the town where the secret city, where the research was done for the initial atomic bomb, which was what ended the war with Japan, and therefore, as most people know, but also then ended the war that Japan was having with China. So, and that was one thing that really struck me. I hadn't put all those pieces together until I started working on the book. That I wondered, what must it be like to be for my character Renshu, or my father or either of our fathers, if they working at Los Alamos, to work at the same institution lab where the weapon was developed that ended that war. That was so now I've forgotten your question a little bit more about why Los Alamos is in. Wait, will you say it again?
Oh yeah, I think I was just like, what makes Los Alamos such a strange place? And I think you definitely touched on it it's like a secret city. It's a kind of a government secret city.
Yeah, it was a secret city, during okay. So yes, during the development of the bomb, people didn't know weren't supposed to know that it was there, and so there was actually a single mailbox down in Santa Fe where all the mail went to. I think it was 1666 or 1667. There's a club in Los Alamos, which is the post office box down in Santa Fe. So it's a town really, I think, I'm not sure what the current population is, but when I was growing up, it was about 10 or 12,000, somewhere around there. It's always been a secret place, in the sense that the research that the scientists have worked on there over time, much of it has been classified, and no one knows what their dad did. It's so not knowing what your parents did and not knowing where they were from was just something kind of taken for granted, I think, for when I was growing up, and kind of my kids I knew. So it lends itself in some ways to the character of Renshu, who he really doesn't want anyone to know his business anyway. So it suits him if he's working on defense projects that he can't talk about, he's not supposed to talk about, he doesn't want to talk about. But it kind of bleeds into no one wanting to talk about anything that from the past, or beyond what's immediately necessary. I think that's a little bit of what part of the strangeness of Los Alamos that comes through in the book.
Definitely. I can definitely see how that initially is such a welcoming space for Renshu because of all the things that he is trying to hide and avoid. And then eventually over the years, it becomes something that he's not even really sure he wants to have, that shroudedness and that inability to talk about what he's doing with his family. And I also found it so interesting that, this is a town that is largely made up of scientists and their wives. And I loved how you evoked Rachel, Renshu's wife's experience of Los Alamos, where she is with all these incredibly highly educated women, ambitious in their own right, who now are forced to compete for all of these jobs that they might be overqualified for, and there's not very many to go around, and there's nothing to do except be in service to their scientist husbands who can't talk about their work. And I really loved Rachel as a character, how she supported Renshu and was, it kind of allowed him to heal himself, but in doing so, maybe scab over parts of himself that allowed her to truly know him, and for their romantic relationship to go as deeply as perhaps she needed as a person, the things that she sacrificed so that he could have the life that he wanted. And I think that we, also haven't had a chance yet to touch on Lily, the daughter, who's the, third generation, and her experience of Los Alamos, where it's for her just kind of this tiny town where she knows everyone, she can't get a date, she's like isolated from both the white American and Chinese American communities because she's biracial. And so I guess I should gear up to a question. And so my question really is, I wondered how growing up in Los Alamos, outside of the secret part of the lab, what did you take from maybe just the experience of it as a small town, and how did you have that small townness impact Lily, your character's own growth?
Okay, great. So first I want to back up a bit and just say that I'm so glad that you picked up on or commented on Rachel's experience, because when writing about Los Alamos, I did somehow want to acknowledge how difficult it was for a lot of the women in the who were there through the 70s and 80s, the kind of height of the Cold War, as the laboratory recruited more and more people, and quite a few immigrants, Chinese and otherwise. There was Korean population there. There's complicated reasons and in legislation, which is all in the book. Exciting book. but yeah, there was this, lots of really talented women and not that many jobs for them. And I wanted to somehow give voice to what I saw as a frustration, in parents of my friends. So just really glad that you brought that up. I think the insularness of the town and the character of Lily, who's very curious, and in a way, as I was talking about Mei Lin being such a a good mother to Renshu and protecting him from having to solve problems, I think he in turn turns around and becomes a very good father to this young girl by making sure, he doesn't want her to get hurt. He doesn't want her to, no risk. He wants her always to be safe, do well in school. And so she, I guess as kids do, they go for the one things that the parents don't cover. And so she gets quite itchy feet, and she wants to see the world. She wants to experience everything, go everywhere. So she tries to do what she thinks she's supposed to, but she's just too curious. And maybe some of that is a result of having grown up in this rather small community and just this real conviction that there's a bigger world out there that she wants to hear about and explore, even though I think Renshu, who calls himself Henry once he's, takes a Western name, Henry, he knows there's a bigger world out there to explore, but he doesn't think that much of it. I mean, he doesn't want to be out there. So there's, it kind of, maybe it's just the way parents, they try to do one thing for their kids and they do it really well, but then what the kids want is sort of the opposite.
Yeah. Definitely. And it's also interesting to think of the way that inheritance works, because at one point Maylin does comment about how Lily really reminds her of Lillian, who was Renshu's cousin, and how Lily embodies so much of the vivaciousness of Lillian, and how there's just like this interesting spirit in this girl that maybe even without Henry or Renshu's overprotectiveness, that desire to burst out into the world may have always just been passed down to her from the last generation.
Yeah, I like to think that. I do think that you read about that in books, you hear about that in families, where it's not just the way people appear, that seems to be passed down, but sort of personalities and kind of features, sort of the temperaments seem to pop up.
Yes, absolutely. It's just the weirdest thing. And I just want to, keep an eye on the time, and I want to make sure if people have questions, don't be shy about writing them in the Q&A, and I'll read them out to Melissa. But I have many more pages of questions to go. So if nothing comes in because people are feeling shy, then I'm happy to keep going. But I just want to let people know that they should feel free to drop questions into the Q&A. But then while I'm waiting for people to type, something that I was really interested in was, you had mentioned earlier that some of where you drew your story was, the very sparse anecdotes that you got from your father. There was, a sense of not knowing too much about what he did, where, his kind of earlier life. And it made me think about how I read this interview by Pat Barker, who wrote the Regeneration trilogy, which is all set in World War I. Do you know it?
Yeah.
And it's so excellent, and it has a psychological heft that really reminds me of your book as well. But in the interview, she talks about how when she was a young girl, she lived with her grandparents, and she kept noticing that her grandfather had this jagged, long bayonet scar on his back. And she just kept seeing it, just like glimpses of it. And she knew she could not ask about it. He would never talk about the war, where he got it from. But she was just so fascinated by the scar, and in part because she could not ask about where he had gotten it. And this tension between being fascinated and knowing that she should not be fascinated was what ultimately pushed her into writing the Regeneration trilogy. And I feel like there is something to novelists and writers where we do follow these almost forbidden fascinations when we write our novels. And I just wanted to know if that resonates at all with you, this idea of being drawn to off-limit subjects.
Yeah, that's incredible. I didn't know that about Pat Barker, but I think that tension is it's fascinating and really useful, because what I had from my dad, as I mentioned, were just, a few notes. And I had them for 20 years before I did anything with them. But then once I decided to pull them out and start looking at them again, I could have asked him. I could have said, "Tell me more." I could have gone. I didn't want to. I could see he was a happier person now, and I didn't want to upset him. But I think that not knowing exactly what his take was on all this gave me permission to imagine my own version and find other people's versions. And I think that and I was quite nervous, like what would he say when he read it. But I mean, unfortunately he didn't read it. He passed away before I finished, but he did know I was working on this story, and he did know I was planning on a trip to go to Taiwan and China. Did he know I was going to go to China? I'm not sure. I did. So I went to both. I'm not sure he knew I went to China. But yeah, for years I was very reluctant to really think carefully about this. And then when I did, I think I couldn't think about anything else.
Yes.
And that was, and I think it was that I've got to not break the promise that I set out in the short story. I'll do anything to not break that promise, even if that means, reading about this history that I always thought was so taboo. And yeah. So
that makes sense. That you were storing up all this creative energy for years and years. How else would you have had? Yeah, how else would you have been able to write such an ambitious novel if not having stored all this curiosity up for so many years? I would have just pooped out within the first decade of what you covered.
Yeah, I think that must be it. I think I'd never written anything longer than about 5,000 words before writing this, and that 5,000 words was that short story. And anything else I had tried to write, like you say, I was just like, okay, I'm done. 2,000 words, that's enough. I've answered whatever question I had. So this just had some different kind of momentum of its own that it needed to be written.
Yes. Oh my God, that is both. It shocks me that you hadn't written anything longer than 5,000 words before this point, and yet I think that makes a complete sense. That if you didn't have the thing to drive you to write those pages, I've definitely attempted to write novels that I realized I was not interested in, and it wasn't enough to not have the interest to keep going.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that one day I'll find another thing to be interested in. I guess either there's that fear, will I ever be so taken with something again? But whether I am or not, it was kind of amazing to be that interested.
I see both a really lovely message from Melissa, which I just want to make sure, Melissa, it's there so that you can read it on your own. And then Ruth is asking an interesting question because she's wondering what does Nai Nai mean? Will she find out if she keeps reading? And I would say yes, she will find out if you keep reading. But Melissa, do you want to explain what Nai Nai is?
Nai Nai is named for a paternal grandmother. Although I've learned so, and actually feel free to correct or adjust. So I thought that Nai Nai and Yeye were the names for paternal grandmother, and Gong Gong I think is maternal grandfather, and Po Po is maternal grandmother. Is that right? But then I learned that in the different parts of China, they swap them around.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm trying to be so careful with which one is maternal, which one is paternal, but actually.
Yeah. And then there's another mixture, because I called my maternal side Lao Ye and Lao Lao. So it's I didn't use Gong Gong, but then my cousins do. So I don't even know if it's a regional thing as well, because my maternal grandparent, I have no idea why it switches around either. I'm equally lost. There's so many different family names. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah, and then you have these names that indicate the relation between, you use one name for an uncle who's on this side and a younger uncle and older. Yeah, I saw one chart in one book and I thought, I'm not ever gonna.
Although, it's if you know all of them, you can be very specific and you immediately know exactly what someone's lineage is based off of that. So there's that. And then it looks like Alyssa has a question. So she writes, in a different interview you did, you mentioned that there were about 10 moments or episodes in the novel that you knew from the beginning had to be there, and you shaped the novel around those. Would you be willing to talk about what some of those specific moments or passages were?
Oh, wow, someone's come to more than one. Things that I knew had to be in the novel. Some of them. So maybe I think what I was maybe referring to is when I was initially drafting, I had a document. It was maybe a Scrivener document, actually, but it could be a Word document. Anyway, it doesn't matter. These are just word processing programs. And it was called 30 scenes in, and at that point, the book was called Henry Dreams an Orchard, because that was the name of the short story. And they were just different things that I knew I wanted to have in the novel. And I didn't know how they all connected. I knew that there was going to be a conversation between Mei Lin and Ren Shu's uncle, who goes by the name of Long Wei. I knew that. And that conversation it moved around. At one point it was in the city of Chengdu, and another point it was in a different city. So, and then I knew there were some details about these trees that were going to be kept in. There was some of these things were sort of a little bit frivolous. There was something about watermelon seeds that I wanted to keep in. So I think the point is that with those different scenes or moments that had to happen, maybe they gave me almost like ballasts. And so maybe I would change how characters got from A to B, but I knew that they were always going to have, these scenes always needed to happen. And maybe it just kept me a little bit of focus, or not, the focus isn't the word, but when you're generating, like writing a novel, there's so much of the first part is just generating and you just, and you throw away, I threw away, probably as many words as I wrote, but kind of to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's like, well, what do you really care about? And what do you know you want to have in the book? And maybe that's what some of those were. I don't know if that addresses the question, but
yeah, I think it definitely does. Ballast is a good way of putting it. And, I can even use the metaphor you've been using before of seeds that you've mentioned. They, were the seeds of a lot of the big parts of the story that then unfolded from these moments that you knew you wanted to keep in, perhaps. So it looks like we have time for one more question. Or Atticus, is it time to stop? No?
No, go for that. Go hit that last.
Hit that last question. It's a classic question. Jennifer's really enjoying the book so far, but I think we're also curious, are you working on any other writing projects or planning any for the future?
I am planning something for the future. I don't know. I am actually, this morning I finally wrote again. I like to just write without knowing what I'm writing about. And this morning, for the first time in a long time, I did, 20, 30 minutes of just write whatever turns up on the page. Yes. And that actually felt really good, because I wasn't writing about either this novel or things about this novel. I was just writing about New Mexico. Yes. So I think, I do hope that there's more to write, and I guess I did say that LaSalle almost deserves its own novel. I don't know that I'm not, that's a crazy town. I love it, but it is. Watch this space.
Well, I've always heard that writers really only have one story that they're telling. They're just telling it over and over again in different ways. Do you feel like what you might be working on next is a continuation of a story that you were trying to tell with this first novel?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I think a few things that have sort of ideas that have floated by have, I've had a few ideas that are sort of different types of historical fiction that pick up on some of these themes. I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to follow those, but I do agree with this idea that writers find their themes that they tend to circle around in different ways. And I'm not sure yet which themes from this book will be ones that I circle around again. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're going to choose for you. We have no control. Well, I'm really looking forward to see what possesses you next, Melissa, because I think that, I just so enjoyed this novel, and I hope that people go out and read it if they haven't already.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Lillian. It's fantastic.
And everybody who's here should go buy a copy of Peach Blossom Spring. We've got a link in the chat. And after this conversation, how can you not? So exciting. And thank you so much, Melissa and Lillian. This has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on for a bit.
Great. Thank you. It's been a real honor and really a good time. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
then thank you everybody else for coming and hanging out with At Home with Literati. Go buy Peach Blossom Spring. The link is in the chat.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Good night,
Have a good
everyone.
night, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.